It's sometimes said that good gameplay can salvage a bad story, and that this is in fact a major distinction between how we evaluate video game stories versus those in other media, where the lack of an interactive element usually allows narrative to take center stage. As I am a filthy casual who only plays on normal mode, however, I expect that any commentary I have to offer on the gameplay of Fire Emblem Engage will be immediately dismissed by those who are already hard at work min-maxing Maddening until they break it in half. Therefore, I'm not going to bother, only saying that Engage's gameplay is fine. It's fun and reasonably varied, and while it's possible to get bogged down doing side content in the Somniel, unless you're a speedrunner, I don't see that being too big of an issue. Let's go back to that original question, though. Does the good gameplay of Engage salvage its bad story? That's a purely subjective call, of course, but I don't know if I'm willing to accept that summation on its face, that Engage has a bad story. At least, not without some qualification. What stands out to me the most about Engage's writing is not the apparent lack of substance, or the abundance of campy anime nonsense, although we'll circle back to those later, but rather that it's arguably the least politically minded Fire Emblem ever written. It's facing some stiff competition from Blazing Blade, the one game that doesn't even have a war in it, but Engage sets itself apart by offering next to nothing in the way of grounded political drama. Right from the beginning, it's about fighting zombies and an evil dragon and collecting interdimensional nostalgia bait. It is, in a word, a safe story that never attempts to give any of its antagonists, or even some of the protagonists for that matter, any complex or sympathetic motivations beyond, I was alone and being alone made me sad. The writing can as such come off as rather saccharine, especially when the resolution amounts to, naturally, saving the world through the power of friendship. At the same time, however, I can't ignore that Engage knows exactly the kind of story that it's telling, and is structured and paced rather well with major story beats that land appropriately in the moment. That's the case for the bombastic scenes of all the characters and all the emblems standing at Alir's side ready to beat whatever villain they're about to face, but it's true for the story's low points as well. Fire Emblem is no stranger to the dramatic Act 1 setback, and Engage certainly delivers on that score with a map that calls back to a similar one in Awakening, but more like the notorious barbecue of Genealogy of the Holy War, or Dimitri's enforced isolation in the first half of Azure Moon. This is a setback that the player is made to feel as well, by stealing away all the emblems you've collected up to that point, and even briefly forcing you to play without the ability to rewind turns. That sequence was legitimately more of a punch than I thought this game would be willing to pull going in. And as with everything else, it's helped greatly by the fact that Alir arguably surpasses Corrin as the most fully realized character of all Fire Emblem avatars. They have a history that ties directly into the story, ingrained fears and flaws that they need to overcome as part of their character arc, and a distinct voice and personality, albeit a rather bland one. And sure, Alir is kind of an amalgamation of every previous mainline avatar, blending Robin's connection to the main villain, Corrin's character arc, Byleth's divinity, and even Chris's deep but conspicuously non-disruptive bond with Marth. I still don't like Alir or the concept of avatars in general, but Engage puts in significantly more work than the earlier games to justify their convenient amnesia and the god-complex power fantasy that makes up their interactions with the rest of the cast. And indeed, when we look at Engage's story as a whole, it's notable that it lacks many of the writing problems that have plagued recent titles. There aren't any disconnected plot arcs like in Awakening, no glaring logical holes and world-building oddities like in Fates, and I don't foresee anyone arguing about this game's basic plot points years down the line as they still do with Three Houses. Engage may very well be the most competently written original Fire Emblem story since at least Path of Radiance, and what it may lack in ambition, it makes up for by leaning into its uncomplicated, linear writing. Speaking as someone who spent years in the proverbial trenches of Three Houses discourse, that linearity is refreshing in its own way, and it's honestly encouraged me to reevaluate the way I often think of these games in terms of their relative levels of writing ambition. I'll always admire the stories like Genealogy and Radiant Dawn and Fates and, yes, Three Houses, that try and fail in messy ways, but there's something to be said too for a well-presented, straightforward experience that unapologetically ropes in all of the familiar Fire Emblem tropes for maximum nostalgia. And that's not even getting into the emblems themselves. The emblem characters are, again, fine. They're written in the same carefully neutral style as what you'd see of them in Fire Emblem Heroes, which is appropriate to the needs of a mobile crossover, and, as it turns out, also suits a game where they're essentially mascots for the franchise rather than characters in their own right. None of the emblems are all-time favorites of mine, and one in particular I've criticized at length, but they add more momentum to the story and open up so many strong gameplay options that it's easy to overlook their status as magical MacGuffins that turn 90% of the plot into an elaborate fetch quest. The Legacy Paralogs are also a fantastic addition, and while Awakening's DLC came up with the same idea a decade ago, it's always fun to see how IS can reimagine and update these old maps for newer mechanics. I'm looking forward to more of these paralogs being added in the DLC alongside the new emblems, probably even more so than I am the vague details about a new side story and characters in the final wave. I'm not immune to nostalgia bait myself, and as an anniversary piece, Engage does a great job of showing off highlights from across the series. As for the cast of Engage itself, well, I haven't gotten all of the supports yet, but even so, it'd be a stretch to call most of these characters fascinating or dynamic. Engage mostly avoids the sort of one-note gimmick writing that Awakening and Fates are infamous for. And even when characters do spend their supports discussing their silly, mundane interests, it's made less bothersome by there being fewer supports overall. Comparisons between Engage and Three Houses inevitably bring up the darker character writing of the Fovlin games. But darker doesn't necessarily equal good, and it's not as though those games don't have their share of gimmicky comic relief characters like Bernadetta and Raphael that, if anything, stick out even more against the backdrop of a story that at least wants to be a grand and serious political epic. In that sense, Engage's characters fit perfectly with the over-the-top costumes and the laid-back atmosphere of the Somniel, and the incredibly linear stakes. That said, though, the return to a more traditional story structure leads to Engage's characters having fewer interactions outside the support system, and without that, it can be difficult to get invested in many of them. In my experience, what most fans of Three Houses enjoyed about the game was not so much its darkness, but rather that it offers a variety of sets of characters that players could gravitate toward according to their taste, and then fill in the gaps left by the story's often underdeveloped writing. To use a fandom term, players had their blorbos, and anyone who's followed me for a while will know that I had several Three Houses blorbos myself, and they were able to frame their experiences with the game around the particular characters that appealed to them. I'm not entirely certain that anyone in Engage's cast is developed enough, either individually or in groups, to encourage that sort of response in players. The game attempts a version of the faction-based branding that defined both Fates and Three Houses, with each of the nations of Elios sporting its own distinctively colored heraldry and the suggestion of broad cultural differences, but this never amounts to much of anything in the story, and quickly resolves with all the nations banding together against the main villain, so the chances of Engage inspiring that same kind of fandom factionalism are minimal. Furthermore, it doesn't help that the game, or the English localization at least, is characterized by a certain juvenile quality in its relationship writing. Multiple support lines end with the characters explicitly affirming that they are friends, as if saying that would be enough to deter people from shipping them, and of the S-rank equivalent conversations that I've seen, some are censored in comically transparent ways where the dialogue is mutually intimate and obviously reads as romantic, but for the insertion of platonic markers like ally that don't match the weight of the conversation surrounding them. In the future, after I've had time to see more of the supports, I might have to devote an entire video to exploring why the support writing of Engage falls victim to the game's determination to be as safe and neutral as possible, even as it's fighting a losing battle against Fire Emblem's iconic, tasteless camp. It's in the designs of some of the characters. It's in the weirdly romantic but not really vibe of characters engaging with emblems that people have been joking about since the game was first announced. It's in the characters waking up Alir with a face full of their crotches as the latest iteration of face-touching and tea time. And it's even in little bits like the return of the Bara bandits. Although, at least in the localization, they're exceptionally toned down compared to what you expect. As with the character writing, that sort of risque silliness does feel tonally consistent with Engage as a whole, much more so than it ever did in Three Houses. Now, does all that mean that I prefer Engage to Three Houses? Probably not. If only for the petty gripe that the game offers much weaker motivation for 100% completion, with no New Game Plus and all of its log content tied to individual save files rather than to the main menu, killing any sense of macro progression. Still, the gameplay is fun enough to where I can see myself replaying it a few times, and if there's anything of interest to be mined from the support system, in spite of its awkward constraints and the even more centralized presence of the Avatar, it'll certainly be something worth talking about. Much like Awakening before it, Engage is a celebratory piece of Fire Emblem history, but rather than a scattered and uncertain swan song of elements plucked from past games, Engage is much more confident in the image of the series it's hoping to project. Helped, of course, by the reality that all of this could be cynically dubbed a tie-in to the lucrative mobile gacha that's going to be keeping the lights on at Intelligent Systems for the foreseeable future. That's my take on Engage's story after my first playthrough, but what do you guys think? If you've been playing Engage, how do you think it holds up to the rest of the series? Is the game what you thought it would be going in, or did it surprise you at all? Tell me about it in the comments. And be sure to like the video and subscribe to my channel for more Fire Emblem content of all sorts. Thanks for watching. Au revoir!